A new year means new Land Rovers, and while nothing has necessarily changed since we're still in the 2019 model year, I think it is still worth noting the differences in the models because there's always confusion from the general public about the Land Rover model lineup. And I have to admit that even as an enthusiast, it is kind of difficult to keep up with the different types of Land Rovers. For instance, if you go on Land Rover's website, it puts the Discovery Sport right next to the Discovery, when really that's not how I've always perceived the model lineup. For some reason right now we have 4 different types of Range Rovers and only 2 Land Rovers. But really today we're doing a very quick, simple overview of the Land Rover 2019 model year lineup. So hopefully, even though I'm not too sure it will, this video clears up some of that confusion. However, it's very possible you leave just as confused as you were before, because really, the model lineup with their naming has always and probably will always cause some confusion. First up is the little engine that could, the Land Rover Discovery Sport, coming in at just around $38,000. This is the cheapest, strangest, quirkiest, entry-level Land Rover that you can get right now, and really it was introduced as sort of a replacement for the Freelander 2, or over in the US, the LR2. Originally people assumed that the Range Rover Evoque was actually the replacement for the Freelander, but it turns out Land Rover had something else in mind, the Discovery Sport. Over the last few years, Land Rover has introduced a few cheaper models into their lineup, such as, well, the Evoque and the Discovery Sport. And while they had the Freelander before, the Freelander is something completely different. The new Discovery Sport is really focused on being a luxurious crossover SUV with tons of capability. However, the original Freelander was very much so more focused on capability. With that being said, Land Rover over the last few years have also been introducing tons of different tech into their models. The new Range Rover Velar, for example, is littered with different electronic components that will inevitably fail, but during the time that they're working, they are absolutely incredible. Overall, they've been introducing so much tech into their cars, but the Discovery Sport, even for $38,000, is kind of lacking behind everything else in its class. And I love the Disco Sport. It's such a fun little peppy Land Rover to drive, but compared to even the Range Rover Evoque, it's just too far behind. Don't get me wrong though, because the Disco Sport is still one of the most comfortable small crossover SUVs, whatever we call them these days, as well as it has tons of capability and it's actually extremely pleasant to drive. But while it is such a great little SUV that packs a bit of a punch and is so capable, it's hard to justify saving just a few $1,000s and then missing out on what the Evoque actually offers. Although with that said, the third row optional seating in the Land Rover Discovery Sport is actually something that we don't see too frequently in the Land Rover model lineup, and especially in something that small. Surprisingly enough, it has more legroom in the back than this full-size Range Rover from 2011, and sitting in the very back third row seat of the Disco Sport, it's actually not too bad. Next up we have the baby Range Rover, the Range Rover Evoque. And now, when the Evoque was launched, it was sort of a joke in the Land Rover community, but I was never able to understand why. I think the Evoque is actually pretty good. Sure, it's meant for a completely different market, and not too many people, if anyone hopefully, are going to take it up to Hell's Revenge and try to do all of these off-road courses. In fact, it probably won't see more, for the most part, than a gravel driveway. But for what it is though, the Evoque is actually pretty impressive. I've always said that if the smaller cars like the Discovery Sport and the Velar and the Evoque are how Land Rover financed doing the bigger projects with the new Discovery and the new Range Rover, then by all means go for it, because otherwise we probably wouldn't have these. The Evoque has been with us for a while now, and for a very long time really nothing changed too much through the model lineups. You would see some tweaks here and there, but really it wasn't until this year that Land Rover announced a completely new design, or well, updated design for the Evoque, and they've pulled it off very well. During this redesign, they made it look much more similar to the new Velar, which we'll talk about here in a minute. And during this redesign, they made the Evoque actually worth it again. So the base model Evoque starts at about $42,000, and if you want to absolutely ruin your chances of ever looking good or ever holding any value or any chance of selling it to someone else, you can check out the Evoque convertible for $52,000. And fair enough with that, I do kind of see how people think the Range Rover name has been, well, ruined over the last few years. An Evoque convertible is, as much as I love Land Rover and their higher end models and really would love to do more with different Land Rovers and especially newer models, the Evoque convertible is just kind of a joke. I honestly expected that they would have cut the Evoque convertible by now, and with the launch of the Velar, I'm surprised they didn't, and I'm really surprised the Evoque was redesigned rather than just being cut, but I'm really glad they didn't, because driving an Evoque is actually like driving just a little Range Rover go-kart. And now it's time for the new kid on the block, the Range Rover Velar, and oh, how I love the Velar. And whether you love the Velar or you absolutely hate it for everything it stands for, if you've ever driven one, you know that it's absolutely incredible to drive. From the exterior styling to the interior detail and all of the technology that went into the interior, it's absolutely incredible. And in fact, for a while, I stood by the fact that everything it offered was of better value than the big L405 Range Rover. Well, the base model Velar starts around $48,000 with its little 4-cylinder engine and is actually kind of slow and disappointing to drive. If you're going to buy it, get the R Dynamic at about $58,000. It's so much more of a better experience, it's better equipped, and it has a much smoother engine, which makes a huge difference driving around town. The interior components and all of the optional extras that you get with the R Dynamic means that it is such a better value than the base model Velar. And I mean, yeah, you could get the base model Velar with its flat front end, but have you ever seen how gorgeous an R Dynamic looks to a base model Velar? We're finally getting to a price point where Rovers in general are starting to get really good and really worth their money. Now, don't get me wrong, the Disco Sport, the Evoque, and the Velar, the base model Velar, are all really worth the money that they are. But once you pass that $50,000 mark, you start getting into the options and the tech and the standard equipment that really you look for when buying a new Range Rover or Land Rover. Let's be honest, Land Rover aren't really that great at building cheap consumer cars. It's never really been something they've been too good at. But when it comes to building the best of the best of the best, nobody touches them. And at the time, I fully expected that Land Rover were going to kill off the Evoque in favor of the larger, better, newer, much nicer Velar, but in fact, they didn't. I was honestly pretty surprised when they chose to keep it around, and while it's pretty good, I just couldn't justify spending that much on the Evoque when the Velar is just a bit more, but so much nicer on the inside, outside, and really it's such a special occasion to drive, and above all else, the Velar is just special. And now it's time for the big boy, the Land Rover Discovery. And while on Land Rover's website they group this down at the very bottom, right next to the Discovery Sport, I consider this to be right under the Range Rover Sport as far as the model lineup goes. And really, this is based on pricing, but it's also based on my own personal bias. This has been one of the most talked about Land Rovers in years, and people either absolutely love it or they think it's a front to one of the best names that Land Rover have ever made and one of the best in the industry. Personally, I go back and forth with the design on the new Land Rover Discovery. I don't hate it, but it also doesn't work as well functionally as the previous generation Discoveries and LRs did. The Discovery starts around $52,000, but it's always been one of the most capable SUVs in the world. Its design has presented some new challenges when off-road. The overhangs on the rear make it a little bit less favorable than the previous design on the LR4 and Discovery 4, and overall the design looks a bit unbalanced compared to Land Rover's reputation for having such an attention to detail and making things look seamless and effortless. Overall though, the new Discovery provides just as much capability as you could expect, especially for something in that price range. And overall, it's pretty difficult to beat that capability with anything else in that price range. No SUV provides more value for the money than the Discovery, and because of that, it still has a soft spot in my heart, even though it looks like the design kind of fell over. The interior though is actually extremely well put together and extremely luxurious, especially compared to previous generations of the Discovery. The driving experience is matched by few, especially for other off-roaders in that price range, and the overall occasion of driving the Discovery is very special. I'm just not too sure people are that impressed with the design, at least as of right now. And now it's time to talk about the Range Rover Sport, and with that, $67,000 will get you one of the best looking cars or vehicles ever produced. The first few years of the Range Rover Sport, the original 2006 model, looked a bit odd. I always got the impression that this Sport was just kind of thrown together in a factory with some spare parts and shipped out. It wasn't until the later years of the original Range Rover Sport that it finally grew into its body and kind of looked correct. But then with its redesign just a few years ago, it actually turned into one of the best looking SUVs ever. From its aggressive exterior to its welcoming and luxurious interior, the Range Rover Sport is really in a class of its own. It's beautifully balanced, and for what it is, it's pretty spot on perfect. Originally, you would only buy the first generation Range Rover Sport because you couldn't afford the full-sized Range Rover, but now, I get it. It truly is in a class of its own. It's beautifully designed, and the interior quality matches that of the full-sized Range Rover. And last but not least is the flagship model, the 2019 Range Rover L405. The one single SUV that captures absolutely everything in one package, except third row seats. If you've ever taken the time to drive the full-size L405 Range Rover, you'll never be able to drive anything else without comparing it. And you can just throw the kids in the boot. Everything about the 2019 Range Rover L405 full-size, full-fat, whatever you want to call it, is absolutely perfect. And for a starting price of around $89,000, nothing comes close to the value and the prestigiousness of the Range Rover. Funny enough though, the starting price for this actually makes the full-size Range Rover very good value. Every time you step into an L405 Range Rover, you're reminded just how far Land Rover have come in the past 10 years. While the L322 is really good and near perfect, the L405 took everything to a completely new level. It is the best of the best, and I have never driven anything that comes close to the driving experience of the L405. Match that with its world-renowned capability, and you have the perfect recipe for a luxury SUV. So with that, there is an explanation, a brief explanation of the 2019 Land Rover model year lineup. And I cannot wait to be able to introduce the 2020 Land Rover Defender to this channel. This is going to be such an amazing topic to talk about. Next week, I actually have a video coming up exactly about the 2020 Land Rover Defender.